Kia ora koutou. Welcome to HR Chats with me, Te Radar. This is a series of chats about HR, where we talk to people around the burning issues of the day in the HR sector, interesting trends and ideas, and we have a diverse range of people lined up as well to chat with. And as we mentioned at the start of these, if there is a topic or a person you think we should talk to, feel free to reach out and let us know, and we'll try to arrange that. Today, we are talking with Amy Clarke. Amy is currently working as a business partner in the People and Culture team at HRNZ. She was, you may have seen the profile a little while ago, a profile in HRNZ or for HRNZ, talking about the importance of empathy in HR and her journey from being adopted as a baby in Romania to an HR professional based here in Wellington, New Zealand. She has a passion for respect and inclusion, is particularly interested in intersectionality, allyship, and the importance of using privilege to create safe spaces for those that need them both inside and outside the workplace. What a pertinent topic. Hello, Amy. I'm very good and very much looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to start with a word that people may struggle to kind of understand. It's very much in the dialogue and the dialect at the moment. Intersectionality.
Sure.
What does that mean?
So I guess to me, intersectionality is kind of the crossover of different areas where disadvantage is particularly pertinent or evident. So often we see things like intersectionality when we talk about pay equity. So we know that generally women are paid lower than their male counterparts. And when we put some sort of ethnic lens, for example, over that, if you are a member of an ethnic minority, then you are more often than not paid less than your Eurocentric counterparts if you're in a say if you're Māori or if you are Pacifica or Asian. So that's kind of an example of intersectionality would be gender and ethnicity overlapping to create a disadvantage.
So I guess people could sort of picture that as a Venn diagram or one of those sort of graphs. As you sort of apply more filters onto something, you can just see that those stats change as they go through all of this. I guess Stats New Zealand is probably a really good place to mine all of this data, to keep searching through and refining things down. Do you get access to much of that? Does it change the way that you think about things?
Look, I think that it's best for everybody that they keep me well away from the statistics here.
Do they give you little PDFs of things and go, you might find this interesting?
Yeah, look, there's lots of information here. I think that it's a really awesome place to work, and I think that Stats NZ are doing some really cool stuff with leading the way with lots of things across the data system. And I'm really lucky that I've got some wonderful people around me who are the analytical experts who I lean on. My friends and family and colleagues and peers will know that maths is not my strong suit per se, but but HR is. So that's why I work in the HR profession and not as a statistician here.
Allyship. Where should we start? Allyship? What? When we're talking about diversity and inclusion as we are today, what is a good starting point where you talk to people about it? Where do you begin?
So I think that allyship for me is a really key part of that whole kind of sphere of privilege, I think, in understanding that. And I think that typically a lot of places have. If I use an example of kind of executive sponsorship as as an example, the trend of, or not, it's not a trend, the act of having an executive there that supports a piece of work or a minority group that might not have had that voice or that sphere of influence internally is really important. I think for me, now that executive sponsorship in D&I related things is kind of we've matured, I think, as lots of different organisations, as a country. I think we've come a long way with finding a place for that internally in the workplace. And I think that now that we're kind of at that stage, it's wonderful to open up the conversation about, allyship versus sponsorship. And that, for me, allyship is not only giving a minority group a voice, but bringing them to the table and then stepping back as that sponsor or that ally and allowing the minority voices to be heard. I think that's kind of, that's kind of how I see it. So I think allyship is where you let the group that you are trying to support or be an ally for give you how they would like your support to be utilized, I suppose. So sometimes it's really important for groups to allow their sponsors or their allies to speak for them if for whatever reason, it's too complex an issue. It's been a hard road, but I think from my experience, most importantly, is allowing people to speak for themselves.
And likewise, allowing people to speak also means that people should very consciously be listening. Listening's a hard thing for people.
It is. Yep, it's a skill.
What would be, if you could give anyone any advice on the notion of listening, because people think they listen, is there any advice you could suggest for active listening, for really engaging?
I think that for me, the key to active listening is to leave all of your assumptions at the door, and that's something that's really important when we talk about inclusion at any stage or in any space. It's that in order to be a really good ally, in order to be a really wonderful support, the act of listening is so important, and dropping your assumptions and letting people tell you who they are and how they want to work with you or how they want to operate in a space. If you do that, I think that you quickly find a far more meaningful way to support lots of different groups, not only minority groups but other groups as well.
Yeah. There was a word you mentioned, and it has been very much at the forefront of conversation. And I know I've reassessed my life based upon this word, and that is the word privilege. A lot of people, particularly when you mention, say, for example, white privilege, people react, they don't like to be called on that. But, it's a pretty important kind of conversation to have, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely is. And, I think that privilege is something that I have, I think we're all unlearning behaviours when it comes to privilege, right? And I think that's a really wonderful and powerful thing for us to be doing. I think that privilege, I observe it a lot in an HR space. So, as HR professionals, we work in areas where we have a lot of influence and we have a lot of reach. And I think that that's something that it's easy to forget, because in HR, that's something that we've always kind of had, right? Like often HR has a seat at the table, or the plan for HR is to have a seat at the table. And I think that the act of acknowledging that as HR professionals is something that will be a massive, massive help in, not only supporting diversity and promoting inclusion, but I think in general, it's a really powerful thing. I've sat around the table with other groups that, community groups in the rainbow community, for example, that I'm a part of, and listening to people talk and hearing the stories about, how they try and support and push movements inside their own organizations. A lot of people aren't part of an HR team, and so their first step is that they've got to get that engagement, that buy-in from the HR team, and then from there they've got to kind of foster that relationship to put in the next steps of whatever it is that they're trying to kind of lead or support. And if we already sit at that HR table, that's one less step, and we have the keys we have those influence keys there. So I think it's really important that we're aware of that, and we use our powerful good, I suppose.
Yeah. If you could, for people who may have heard of privilege, is there a way of summing up the many iterations of what privilege kind of entails? Because is it sort of a good gateway into understanding where we're going with the rest of this conversation?
Yeah, I think so. And privilege is it's a really complicated thing, and I'm very aware that as a white person myself, that I have to acknowledge and be aware of my own privilege anytime I kind of walk into a space. I think that that's kind of a really important thing to be aware of. And I think that if I think about my own privileges as an openly out gay cis woman in New Zealand, that my privilege is that I can walk down the street with my wife. If we're not holding hands, then we become invisible, and that is a privilege in and of itself. A lot of people in the rainbow community, they can't do that. They don't have the luxury of being able to do that. And so I think that yeah, it's a very, multifaceted thing. And I think then if we go, I carry a lot of privilege with me when I kind of walk through the world, and somebody who has many of my kind of, traits, attributes, that is maybe, or that identifies as heterosexual rather than as gay, that's another layer of privilege that they have. And if I was, a part of a visible ethnic minority, that would be another layer of privilege. So yeah, it's a very complicated thing. And I think that the key thing for me is we don't have to get this, nobody's expecting us to get this perfect. We know that it is really complex, but I think that acknowledging and being open to learning when it comes to our privilege and how our privilege impacts other people is the key.
You have probably, I guess, I have it, certainly the privilege of bringing our whole selves to work. A lot of people don't have that. Can you talk about the notion of what it means to bring your whole self to work, or to have a workspace that allows people to bring their whole selves to work?
Yeah, sure. I think that, for me, that question's quite a complex one. I think that if I said to you, what does bringing your whole self to work mean? Like, if I asked you that question, what would some of the things be that you would go, that's a part of that?
That's a very good question. Gosh, I guess bringing. What does that mean? Like, I thought I knew what it meant, and now that you've put me on the spot, I'm thinking, does it mean that I can bring my background? I can talk about my family. I can talk about what I do when I go on a holiday, without feeling that I need to moderate that. I can talk about my hobbies and my social practices. I could talk about my agnostic atheism, without a worry that there would be a censure of my religious and social beliefs. I could talk about the TV programs I like watching, I suppose. You know what I mean? Without
Yeah.
any fear that anyone would judge me or pass me over or move me out or on.
So I think this is maybe a really good example, right? Because those things are all correct, and there's no right or wrong answer to what it means to bring your whole self to work. What it means for me is that I can come to work and I can use the correct pronouns for my partner, my wife. I can walk into a room and be confident or feel safe talking about who my partner is and what my background is. And I think that's when I think about bringing my whole self to work, that's the first thing that comes to mind. And I think that my wife and I have been together for 11 and a half years. We got married in January, and the journey that we have had throughout the length of our relationship in different workplaces has been really, really different. So I would say that I am more myself at this job than I have been at any job previously. And it's, a lot of it is that internal growth thing, but a lot of it is how visible representation is in other organizations or places of work, that little things like that give you these invisible signals as an openly queer person, as a minority, that tell you that it's okay to be who you are, or you're not walking into an environment that is unsafe or dangerous. And I know that seems kind of it sounds like kind of an extreme thing to say, but I think that I've had more experiences than I can count where I'm walking along the street or we're walking home at night, and we just we pass a group of people and we decide that it's safer for us to not hold hands in that current moment, and so we do. And that allows us to kind of move through that space in a way where we feel less threatened. But that is those things, the examples of that, they're not years and years in the past. They happen on a weekly basis.
They're happening
So,
today,
yeah, totally.
Many friends, even yesterday I was having a conversation around a similar kind of thing, and you think, gosh, you always think we've moved on, but again, that's that privilege of being within certain bubbles, isn't it? If you're in a bubble where people are more liberal. There's lots of queer friends of different ethnicities. You can almost think that things were getting a lot better on the whole. So tell me, how can HR ensure that their culture in their workplaces is acceptable, or if there are issues, move on from one place to a better place?
I think that, the first thing to note in this space is that change doesn't have to be massive. It can be really, little baby steps. I think that sometimes opening the door to D&I or being open to it in an organization can seem super overwhelming because there are so many factors, right? So I think that the first thing that I would say to anybody that's looking to shift their culture to a more inclusive space is that you don't have to get it perfect to begin with, and you don't have to do everything at once. Start with little things that you think will have a good impact, but not necessarily a massive impact. Like we it's probably for about a year now have had pronouns in our email signatures, which is that's free, that doesn't cost us anything. It's a really amazing way to make sure that we aren't putting the burden on our gender diverse or our non-binary or trans staff to have to be the only ones that do that, to be properly identified as who they are. So little things like that, I think look for the low-hanging fruit. That's definitely a great place to start. I think
I just want to say something here, because this isn't a really important thing, isn't it? And it's where the burden of responsibility falls with diversity and inclusion. And there can be a tendency for people to expect or want the work to be done by the group that needs to be looked after, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Where actually it's beholden to the people who are in those positions to actually do the work. I guess an example of this, you'll see it on social media where someone calls something out and said, look, actually that's not right. And they go, well, go and explain it to me and find some links and show me. It's like, it's not up to me to do all of this extra work and take on this burden. It's up to you to do that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Making
absolutely.
that responsibility
Absolutely. And I think that on that note, the most important part for me in that is that the burden absolutely needs to be shared, and people that are asking for the support of experts in these areas, people that have this lived experience and knowledge and understanding, because they're part of these minority groups, they can't be expected to do all the work, but they must be included and given the option to lead it, because that's where you get that richness, right? That's where you get that's how you bring people to the table. So I think it's a bit of a funny thing, because we have to, we in HR have to recognize that that people are experts in their own rights, but that we can't always expect them to lead. And there'll be some times where people will, they'll have the energy to want to do that, and sometimes they won't. And so it's about consistently checking in with people that you do engage to support these processes, to make sure that they have the energy.
And we spoke, we spoke to Carly about this a couple of weeks ago. In terms of inclusion of Māori in the workplace. That don't because you have Māori, don't expect them to have to do all of the work. Don't put that extra work upon them. But if you are wanting people to do that, then to make that a part of their position, to allow them the time, to reward them, to make that a part of the thing they do at work. While we're here, let's talk about the notion of diversity, because some people may think that it's a relatively sort of it's gender, sexuality, ethnicity, but it's actually a lot wider than that, isn't it?
It is, and I think that it's it's a really massive thing that impacts every part of our lives, whether you realize it or not. I think one of the things that my partner often says to me is that people think that something isn't designed everything is designed, whether it's good design or bad design, somebody has designed that. So it's this thing, this thing that people don't necessarily think exists in every, tangible object. I think that diversity is really similar to that it's everywhere, and there are so many different facets of it, and that there's so much value, there's so much richness in it, that to not want to tap into it and to open the doors of our workplace and hearts and minds to it, I think it benefits everybody. It doesn't just benefit the minority groups that you're wanting to support.
Yeah, because when we're talking about, we're talking around, diversity of backgrounds, urban versus rural. We're talking diversity of intellect. It's good to have people at the table who may have had, have a PhD in something, but someone from the factory floor. There's all of those levels as well. Are there other little ones that people may not be aware of that they should have a little think about when they're looking to put teams together, when they're looking to promote or to recruit?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that the only comment that I would make on that is that diversity of thought is something that we're about. I think that it's sometimes a useful notion to challenge a little bit, because my experience, and this is just my experience, but my experience is that if you have good diversity of thought comes naturally. And if you are looking for diversity of thought, generally it means that that there isn't a good representation of diversity at a table, for example, or on an exec team or whatever. Like that's not a specific example about anywhere or anyone in particular, but it's just it's an interesting concept, I think, to challenge when we do hear it.
Yeah, and look, there is a real sort of belief that a lot of that diversity and inclusion needs to start at the executive level. You'll often see those photographs of boards or things like that, and they all look like the same guy.
They do.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. It's it's historic and systemic, and that is, I think, where we all, not only HR professionals, but all of us have a role to play in helping to kind of crack that. And I think, we often hear that expression, somebody should be appointed on their individual merits. And I couldn't agree more with that. The only thing that I would challenge, in addition to that, is that often that pipeline of talent looks a certain way because of these systemic, historic things that are happening in the background.
That's exactly right. You get your merits in many ways through the privileges of the mechanism that has put you through into these places, that other people have had that for whatever reason, have had that denied to them, which doesn't mean that they're not as competent or capable. It's just that they haven't had that particular channel. Hey, in terms of things that people should think about, that unconscious bias. And I'm sure there's trainings around this. So let's talk about unconscious bias, for example, and ways that people can acknowledge and then perhaps move through that.
Yeah, so look, I think that the first thing that I always like to note with bias is that we all have it. So it's not a bad thing, it's just a thing. And the power in using that in a positive way is recognizing that it's there, and then recognizing what it looks like in yourself as an individual, and then how you can challenge that as you kind of move through different spaces. And I think that there are lots of really awesome free resources that you can get online that help you kind of test your own unconscious bias or your conscious bias. So I would say,
and that can be quite challenging for people, to do a test like that and to realize that actually you think I'm not the kind of good person that I thought I was.
Yeah,
Could you explain to people around unconscious bias? Just explain what it is for people who don't know. I'm sure people do, but just in case.
It is a bias towards a certain outcome or decision or person based on basically your cumulative life experiences. So there are lots of great little pictures. It's probably not the neatest example, and maybe I could find something and edit in, but it's basically it's this kind of concept of fast thinking, slow thinking that happens in your brain in the background while you are assessing a situation. That fast thinking is the stuff that's not necessarily rooted in fact or in tangibility, but based on things that you've seen, done, heard in the past, that presents an opinion or a bias that might not necessarily be true.
Right. I'm going to give an example of it. I may be wrong. For example, you see two people talking in the workplace. You see a white man and a woman of color. And would your unconscious bias would automatically then perhaps assume, if they're dressed the same, the man is the boss. Oh, he must be the boss. And then actually, he's not the boss. It turns out that he is the subordinate. That would be an example of unconscious bias, where you don't think that you're going to be a little bit sort of gender and racial biased, but in that fleeting moment that you make that assumption, that's unconscious bias.
It
Am I
is,
right?
and it is. Yep, that's a great example. And another one would be, if I said without giving you a gender or an ethnicity, have the picture of a doctor in your head, or somebody who works in the police force, or somebody who is a nurse. When I say those things, is there a picture that's coming up unbidden, perhaps, that that when you stop and think about them, you go, well, no, I shouldn't have think that the doctor is a man in my head, or that the nurse is a woman, for example. That's another kind of example of it.
It is, and we see a lot of conversation around that, particularly with encouraging young women in particular into STEM and various other things. That assumption that draw a scientist, and it's generally a man in a white coat. Diversity and inclusion training. You've mentioned that there are lots of free courses online, but if you want to put some of your people, yourself, through a course, are there any that you recommend, or any particular tangent that people take? Do you put small groups through? Is it good to put everybody through? Do you encounter sometimes resistance to people to go, I don't need this, I'm okay?
Yeah,
I said that as a kind of in a white manly kind of way. I don't know if you noticed the unconscious bias of me
embraced
unconsciously.
the stereotype.
Thank you. I was bringing it along.
Yeah, no, it was perfect. Look, I think the training question is kind of a hard one. I think that often people look for a silver bullet for D&I, and there isn't one. I think that in my experience, engaging community groups is a really awesome way to support them and to get a really realistic and kind of grassroots view of the world and learnings and things. So one of the groups that we have engaged here at Stats, and that I have seen do a lot of really amazing work, are Inside Out, who are based in Wellington, and they have come and run some workshops for us, which have been really wonderful, about understanding gender and sexuality. And having people that run these courses that are not only brilliant and patient and kind teachers, but are representative of the groups that they're talking about and they're teaching people about is so important, and I think makes a much richer experience. So yeah, look, training it's a hard one. There are so many different places where you can seek that support from, but for workplaces, I would say look internally first. Put the feelers out to your people, because they understand the unique challenges and opportunities that every workplace has in terms of its culture and how it does or doesn't support different aspects of diversity.
Look, we talk about low-hanging fruit, and I was just thinking, I Googled diversity and inclusion HR in my extensive research, and then, as many people do, went to that first little list of things where you can click the little bar and a list of sort of topics comes up. One of the things that came up in many of the things was something as simple as acknowledging everybody's cultural holidays. It's small. We're talking so those little things as well. You've got all of the kind of high-end training, but then something as simple as an event, a day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really interesting and key point. And it's one of those things that I think when we look at it can be a little bit confronting. But in New Zealand, we have quite a Eurocentric view on employment law, certainly, but on lots of other aspects. So things like, I think, performance is quite Eurocentric as well. And I think that acknowledging different things or impacts or aspects of somebody's culture or ethnicity that might mean that they move and experience a workplace differently, and that they need different things, different kinds of flexibility. I think that being aware of and acknowledging that is a really powerful, and yeah, it's a low-hanging fruit, right? Because I think that to search out that information or to try and understand, it doesn't have to be an enormous and perfect undertaking. You just have to, humbly ask for the assistance of the people that it is you're trying to support.
Yeah. And then just, I guess, being aware of all those other very small differences, the notion of a firm handshake, eye contact, being able to promote yourself. It's a very sort of patriarchal white scenario. And often, we've had so many examples through HR and through life as well of the issues with misunderstanding the notion of those simple gestures.
Absolutely. And I think that, we often forget that gender is a power imbalance in and of itself. So, it's one of those things that we not take for granted. That's maybe the wrong way of putting it, but it's definitely a factor in things that we forget sometimes. And I think that, the key to things like this, or wanting to understand what, how you can support and not assume is, it comes back to that listening thing, the leaving your assumptions and your bias, or checking your bias at the door, not leaving it at the door because it's always with you, but checking it at the door. I think that's all of that stuff's free to do, isn't it? And I think that's such a good step in the right direction.
There's also, other things that people may forget around when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Multi-generational workforces. There can be an implicit bias to either way, actually, towards older, more experienced workers. They're better, or the kind of, we've heard all of the kind of tired old cliches around Gen X and Gen Y and their desire to move through. That's an important notion as well as everything else.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think that's where being aware of bias is so important, because sometimes it's just taking a step back and going, how do we make sure that we're valuing everybody on their own individual merits rather than, using a stereotype and benchmarking everybody against that?
Yeah. Safety signals for groups. People often talk about it's important to have safety signals or safe spaces. And safe spaces is one of those terms that's very easy for a certain group of the populace to deride. But they're an incredibly important thing, a misunderstood thing.
Yeah, I think they are they're incredibly important and potentially misunderstood. And I think that for me, and that they are when as a member of a minority group, when I talk about safety signals, they can be the smallest, tiniest thing. So I have a little rainbow badge that sits on my lanyard at work, and I wear that because I look for that myself when I move through different spaces. And when I walk up and down the street in Wellington, if I see somebody with a rainbow lanyard, then that just makes me go, oh, okay, that is a safety signal for me. So I think that there's a real power in them, but with that power, I think comes, to quote Spider-Man, responsibility, because I think it's really key that we are aware of the fact that those signals are very real and that they send really important messages to people who need them and who are looking for them. So things like writing in a job ad that a workplace is safe and inclusive is really important, and that's the place that we want everybody to be at, right? But I think that really ensuring that you have mechanisms and a culture in place that actually supports that, because people will look for that, and they may base applying for a job or not on seeing something like that in a job ad. And so I think it's really important for all organizations to understand that the tiniest thing can be really important and crucial to somebody in lots of different minority groups coming into a workplace.
Likewise, the allowance of those flippant and offhand comments that can then be justified as it's just a joke. It's that little phrase that and we've all, I'm sure we've all done it, where we've heard someone say something that we think, but we've thought it, but we haven't actually said, no, mate, no, that's not acceptable. But that's an important thing to do, isn't it? Because A, to signal that it's not acceptable, and sometimes B, actually just to remind the person that what you said, you may think that's funny or an offhand remark, but it can be very, very hurtful and quite detrimental to people. We need to call
Yeah,
people out.
yeah, we do, and I think that that's it's all part of this unlearning old behaviors, right? Because we've all done it. It's something that it sucks, but we can only be better. We can only strive to be better
Yeah.
in the things that we do and we say. And I think that
Yeah.
the bystander effect is a really interesting thing. And sometimes it's hard to call people out in the moment, and so it doesn't always have to be mid conversation. If it's easier to have a quiet chat to somebody afterwards, or send an email if you're not somebody who loves face to face or a confrontation, that's totally fine as well.
It also reinforces a power imbalance, because often the person who is going to do the calling out is not in a position to do that. I mean, I've been in that position where someone's been saying something that I think is reprehensible, but I'm an employee. Is it up to me to call them out, or you're a subordinate? And then what happens is you become the problem. You're the problematic one. And we've heard it. You're the mouthy one. Always calling people out. So having structures within that workplace, and then making sure that those structures are very clearly promoted and very safe, because again, you've had people go to someone, say, hey, look, a situation has occurred, and then they ring up the person who's caused the situation, and immediately you know who the person was that's complained about it. Oh, it was her. Generally, she did it. How do people sort that out? How do they? Is it just making sure that their protocols are correct? Is it having an external something that people can go to?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's about having an external kind of person or someone to go to, but I think it's about really looking internally and being quite critical, I think, of what that pathway looks like for people. So putting yourself, as an HR practitioner, putting yourself in somebody's shoes that might need to raise their hand or say something. How can we make it as easy and as safe for them to do so?
Great. We are just about out of time. Anything else you want to add? Any sort of examples of best and worst practice that you've seen in diversity and inclusion?
Look, I'm not someone who likes to focus on the negatives. I think that I just say when it comes to doing really well, the areas that I've seen this done well are led by people who are experts or are members of a minority, but they are supported by people who use their privilege for good. And I think that, like I've said, low-hanging fruit is so important. Don't assume, wait, and let people tell you about themselves, because ultimately, even us card-carrying introverts like to be able to talk about ourselves and who we are. And I think that we unlock so much value in people when we do that.
Marvelous. And it really, if anything, it's we can all be better people. And just begin by, if you are listening to this, I imagine, just go online and find one of those little tests. See if you've got those unconscious biases. And as I say, certainly, I remember when a couple of years ago I first heard that phrase, checking your privilege, and white privilege. And you kind of think, oh, wait, once you become aware of all of these little things, it becomes something that's just there in the back of your mind every time you go into a situation. So, self-improvement, relentless self-improvement, Amy.
Yeah, with kindness, right? I think that's the key thing. Like, so much of what I do, I try and bring back to that. I think that if we engage meaningfully and really kindness at the forefront, we can do so much good stuff together.
Absolutely. Kindness and empathy. Can empathy, you've spoken before around empathy. Can empathy be taught? Can it be a learned thing? Can people be aware of their non-empathetic nature?
I think it's definitely something that comes more naturally to some people than others, but I don't think it's something that can't be learned. I think it just comes from, unpacking some of your own ways of thinking, unlearning some behaviours. And I think that there are, if if you are someone who identifies themselves as or thinks that they are not an empathetic person, I'm sure that you will know somebody who is. So it's if I had someone come to me and say, how do I be more empathetic? I'd go, how much time do you have? So I think it's something that we would love to, it's a piece of knowledge that we'd happily share.
Marvellous. Amy Clarke, what a wonderful conversation. We could talk for ages, but we don't have
We
time.
could.
You've got to go back to work. The listeners have got lives to live. I've got to go and stand around outside for a period of time and breathe some fresh air. Amy, thank you. Amy Clarke, business partner and people and culture, the team at Stats NZ. You've been listening to HR Chats with me, to Radar, for HRNZ. If there is anybody, as we mentioned at the start, that you think we should talk to, if there are any subjects that you would like to have a discussion on, please let us know. Contact details on the website. Thank you for listening. If you haven't listened to the other podcasts, now is an excellent time to do that, and we'll chat again soon.